Focus groups, all of these I'll point out in a little more detail. A traveling kiosk, which I will show you. We did local advertisements, particularly on the radio and the radio interviews, because it's a community where the radio is a significant part of the community, as opposed to some of us who almost never listen to the radio. We did a visioning workshop, and because it was a redevelopment, economic and physical, we actually did a design charrette that went for 5 days, and we invited people to participate. Basically, what you're trying to do in any public involvement strategy of this type, there's the local knowledge, the embedded knowledge of everyone who lives in this community. My amount of local local knowledge is very close to zero. Everyone else has significant amounts, and the idea is how do you begin to recognize and tap into that. Leverage existing social networks. One of the things we discovered early on is if you simply go to the business community and say, could you post a notice that on Tuesday evening there will be a meeting, they're willing to do it, and almost no one shows up. It turns out that in this community, the strength of the community was all through the church organizations. And we had to go to them, and even if we went to the church organization and said, could you post a meeting that on Tuesday evening there will be a notice that there will be a meeting, we might get 10 people to show up. Now, if we went to the church organization and said, Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, you typically have a social mixer. Is it okay if we came there? We'd have 80 people there. And it literally was figuring out the social networks and how they work, and then responding to them. And then literally that last circle of maximizing cross-cultural methods of communication. We all embody our backgrounds, our history, our education, who we are. Generally, our audience is different than we are. And so we had to figure that out and then learn how to work with that and really begin to pull people out and get them involved and engaged. And then once the process started, it began to take a life of its own. It's once you get that critical mass going, the life begins to take off. And that's the sign, I think, of a successful outreach. Bilingual surveys, we'd send the surveys out completely Spanish and English, and we would get the responses. We would also do a website that would update that. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. The issue of focus groups. Very often, if you can even entice people to come to a large meeting, say 50, 60, 80 people, they are petrified of standing up and saying anything. I mean, they may have great ideas, they maybe have lots of knowledge, but they will not stand up. Not even because they're afraid that their neighbors might hear them say something that could be a little controversial. They are petrified of standing up in front of a crowd. If, however, you can break that down into a series of 3 or 4 person meetings where we'll all sit around a table together, and this gets back to that community interviewer process where we sort of empower people to ask the questions. Sometimes you can't stop people from talking. I mean, it's great, the amount of knowledge. So it's a method issue, not necessarily a subject issue or a content issue. People who are scared of any kind of public speaking are more than willing to speak to you in a small group, or in certain cases, individually, one-on-one. You do an anonymous individual interview, you ask people the same sets of questions, and very quickly you develop interesting sets of data. You can begin to compare what different people say across. So you have to work it that way. The community interviewer program, we actually reported back on that to the community, and you can't see this, but the PowerPoint on the screen is entirely in Spanish. And the young lady standing next to the PowerPoint is one of my colleagues. She works with me. Her name is Janet Gonzalez, completely fluently bilingual. And part of what she does in our company is work with us on projects like this. She's also a certified planner, so she has the professional background as well as the language background. And it's basically not just you spoke to us, thank you very much, you'll read a report in 6 months, but you spoke to us next week or in 2 weeks, we'll actually report back and we'll tell you what we heard. So you're closing the feedback loops between people giving you input and then understanding what that input is being used for and what the results were. We did a community-wide visioning workshop. That's a decision. I do know that there have been a number of visioning workshops done here in Holyoke in the last few months, according to what it sounds like, maybe over the last couple of decades. We certainly don't want to repeat a visioning exercise. We are intending to touch base with the consultants who are working on your community downtown vision and your renewal plan, and if there's information to be mined there, we'll take advantage of that. If it looks like we still need to do more of an outreach effort such as this, get the public involved, really open up, and that's a decision that will be made by the folks here, not by me personally, but by the folks here, absolutely we'll set that up. Again, it gets back to those earlier sort of principles that I mentioned. get people actively involved. You don't bring 80, 100, 200 people together for 2 or 3 hours and then just lecture them. You put them around tables, you give them base maps, you give them little games that you've invented. You ask them not necessarily to be competitive, but to try to come up with the best ideas, ideas that get the most interest going. We'll set that up, we'll establish that based on what you tell us and what we discover as we go forward in the next 6 to 8 weeks. In the case of Omaha, you can see it ultimately ended up, this is a community of about 35,000 people throughout the described study area. We had over 2,000 people get involved in some way, shape, or form during that time. 97 focus groups, 400 community interviews, 50 visioning sessions, 1,500 surveys returned, and 200 people came to the charrette. So we can absolutely craft the public involvement process here to reach out to the community in the ways that you tell us make the most sense and will be the most effective. I was also asked to talk a little bit about use of the internet or use of the web, et cetera. There is, I know, an existing internet site set up, so we don't necessarily have to establish one, but that's something else we also do quite regularly. One of the things I've discovered is that what a person will tell you face to face, whether it be in an audience such as this or even in an interview, may be very different from what they will write on a computer with this notion that I am completely anonymous and no one really knows what's happening. And we've actually had situations where we've decided with our clients to sort of discount information we may receive from one way versus the other, because the veil of anonymity sometimes can skew things. But here's a website we set up for a group in Omaha, just the Environment Omaha group. There is a related blog site. So the website is providing information out, pushing information out to the community. The blog site allows them to bring the information back in. We would do things like link streaming video to it, and you could figure out how many hits it was getting. Unrelated but interesting side story, when we were doing we did the downtown Omaha redevelopment plan as well. And 3 days into a 5-day event, a young man comes up to me. He says, "Is it okay if I stream your presentation?" And I'm like, well, I can't really, what am I going to say? No, of course you can do it because you have the camera sitting right there. And so he had a little handheld camera, and he sat right there in the front row, and I talked for about 45 minutes to an hour, and he just kind of streamed it, and he showed me at the end, see, it was a little herky-jerky, but you could hear me, and you had some sense of what I was showing. Well, at about 9:30 or 10 o'clock that night, he uploaded that stream to a website that they had set up about the downtown. And the next morning, there were 76 responses. Not hits, responses. 76 people had written something about it, which completely just floored me. The fact that they would have that instantaneous access, they would know about it, and that many people would actually, in the course of 12 hours, respond to it. So this is a very, very powerful tool. I'm talking to people in Massachusetts about use of the internet. I apologize. But as you all know, the question is, what's the best way to do it here? Because I also suspect that there are probably neighborhoods that don't have a lot of access to the internet. So we have to make sure that we balance the various methodologies. Twitter, a lot of people are on Twitter. We found that that's an interesting, you don't have to read quite as much. 140 characters is a little less than a 4 or 5 page diatribe. But that's also a way to get out and to get interaction. And then finally, the issue of Facebook. So what you tell us as far as we have the technology, we have the technical skills, the capabilities to do any of this and to monitor it. My attitude towards it is let's keep it as simple as possible to get us the results and the interaction that we need just to make it easier for all of us involved. But hopefully even by the discussion this afternoon, we can begin to hone in on what seems like the best way to go. In terms of preliminary input, this is where I think probably, Dan, we should open up the discussion at this point. Sure. Kickoff meeting, site tour, preliminary discussion with the task force. I mean, some of that is happening as we speak. We have to identify who the key participants are, and I suspect that that'll be a fairly extensive list. I don't think we'll come out of today with that, but over time, we have to decide. Is it property owners, business owners, residents, associations? Is it anybody? Is it someone who used to live in Holyoke and has now moved away, but has heard about it somehow? This issue of the preliminary survey, what is the content of the survey, what is the format of the survey, what is the turnaround time on the survey? Is it a simple check-the-box survey? Does it involve writing things in, et cetera? How do we build that? One-on-one or small group interviews with the task force, with community leaders, with stakeholders. I mean, you can say, look, here are 40 people, and every one of them deserves a one-on-one interview. And what it means is Janet and I will come in, we'll suggest 25 minutes instead of 55 minutes, because it's just a time thing. And over the course of 2 or 3 days, we will interview all of those people. The key issue is just to set up the schedule and try to make it work for people. But that's it. We simply go and go and go. Okay, task force stakeholder workshop, public workshops. We think it would make sense to do a workshop with the group here, plus some additional stakeholders. Maybe it ends up being maybe 50 or 60 people. And then take that out to the general public. You tell us, do you want us to do it just a single time, twice, 3 times? You know, how do you want us to do that? How broadly do you want it advertised? Is it more geographic focus? Is it a topical focus? You know, you give us ideas there. In phase 4 and 5, there's a public forum, which is in many ways a reporting out. I mean, at that point, a considerable amount of work will have been done. So to some extent, that becomes simply, you were involved in task 2. Here's what's happened in the last 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, but still allow some mechanism for some feedback. And again, we'll set that up. And then obviously there's the ongoing presentations. A lot of times what we do for a project is we end up putting together a final PowerPoint presentation, which can be used by anybody within the community to give presentations, or it can be set up on a website so people can see the results, so it has sort of a living legacy.